Hi, I'm Jake Ray, and today on the Student Slant, we talk to Mike Thompson of WOSU Radio about audio's place in today's media landscape.
Well, I've always been interested in history and politics and things like that, but when I was a junior in high school, I entered a contest at the local radio station to be a guest host on their sports show uh, one Friday. And what I did was I wrote a poem to get on the show. And you had to submit your reason why you wanted to be on the show, and they put you on the air. And so I read the poem on the air, and they asked listeners to vote, and everyone overwhelmingly voted for my poem. So that was my debut on radio in Worcester, Massachusetts. And then I actually ended up working for that station for 6 or 7 years. So that's how I got in. My name is Mike Thompson. I'm the news content director at WOSU Public Media.
I'm Zach Varda.
And I'm Jake Ray, and this is the Student Slant. So, Mike, getting into radio, there's a lot of differences between journalism and working for radio and writing. And a lot of interns come from our journalism program to WOSU. What challenges do you see coming out of the journalism program to start working for radio from typically writing for a print newspaper?
Well, I think the challenges are less now, to be honest, than they were, say, when I started. Right now, I always say I don't hire radio reporters anymore. I hire multimedia journalists who can do radio, because the industry has converged so much where I think journalism schools and programs around the country have done a good job of teaching students everything, audio, video, print writing, web writing. So basically, it all comes down to writing. Are you curious? Can you tell a story? And then we can mold you to write for the ear, which is what radio is, and also work with you on your voice and things like that. But I think that we really are in the world of multimedia journalists, and we do not have the luxury in radio of just hiring good radio reporters. We have to hire a reporter who can write for the web, who knows how to publish on the web, who can even do a little bit of video and photography. So those days are gone where you can just have a great voice and get on the radio.
I think one of the biggest challenges we've had in doing like a news podcast and trying to be like a radio is getting that voice and the radio inflection. And obviously, you're amazing at it now, but how long does it take to get that voice? And, what are some tips that can help you get there?
Be yourself. Seriously, just be yourself and breathe through your belly. Those are the two big things, really. If you want to have a good voice and use your natural voice, just be yourself and make sure you have plenty of air in your lungs. Again, it's changed since I first started. I mean, it started to change when I got in. You don't have to have that classic radio voice like Edward R. Murrow and have that deep baritone and be all formal. And they used to wear ties when they went and they did radio. You couldn't see them, but you used to wear a suit and tie because it made them sound more formal and more official. Those days are gone, thankfully. Radio listeners now are they want to hear different types of voices. You don't have to have the classic radio voice. And you listen to NPR, you hear all the different accents and quality of, look at Ira Glass. Ira Glass would never have gotten a job in radio 30 years ago. Never. I can guarantee you he never would have gotten a job in radio 30 years ago, and he is perhaps public radio's biggest star. The voice is he's himself. He knows how to tell a story. He writes well. He produces well. He's engaging. He's curious. That's the key in any medium, and radio is no exception.
Yeah, we've been coming to that problem a lot, actually. We've started this other podcast called Lantern Lights, and it's like a daily news podcast for the news stories at the Lantern. That voice has been really tough for us all to get down, really. But besides that, we also have that script writing aspect coming in for writing for radio. And I'm curious, do you ever struggle with transitions, like going from another news story to another? Because that's the one thing I've noticed doing this podcast.
Yeah.
Moving along is always the hardest thing to do. So what are some ideas you've seen, and what some type of experience have you had getting that down?
Well, you want to, the basic, strategy of a newscast going from one story to the other, you want to sort of have a flow. You want to go from a political story to a political story, from a crime story to a crime story. You don't want to go from a really serious, sad story to a happy, light story right away. So that's kind of it's kind of common sense. But what I often tell new reporters or even students is, the next time you have a conversation with your friends, just at the end of the conversation, trace it back, sort of diagram that conversation. You perhaps start talking about, the weather and how it's great weather outside to throw the football around. Then you'll go to talking about the Buckeyes season and how spring practice is going to start. And then, I heard the band out practicing the other day. And you'll talk about how the band If you trace your conversation is like a newscast. It flows from one topic to another, but the topic you end up with could be very different than the one you started with. So if you diagram your conversations with your friends, that tells you how to put together a newscast and how to put together an interview or a conversation. The whole goal of radio broadcasting, talk show producing and hosting, and podcast production and hosting is conversation. You want your show, your podcast to sound like a conversation. So just let it happen. Have a plan of questions you want to ask, but then let the conversation happen. And 9 times out of 10, that'll just work just fine.
Yeah, I think that's pretty amazing, because that is probably the first 4 months. What we struggled with was talking to guests and not just like shooting questions at them, like being in print, where you go for a sit-down interview and you're just, rapid fire at people.
That's the biggest difference between a print interview or a web-based interview. The interview is a means to an end to get information for the newspaper or for a website. For a podcast, for a radio talk show, the interview is the show. So the interview is both to get information, but it's also the product. So it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to have flow. You have to fill in the blanks on the fly. If somebody just says some name out of nowhere, you have to stop the person, clarify who that person is, what department of government they work for, what team they play for, and put it in context. So it's a different skill, but like anything else, with practice, it comes along naturally.
What's it like doing a show on the fly like that? Have you ever had mess ups where?
Oh yeah, legendary mess up. Yeah, I mean, honestly, my biggest fear, and I think the biggest fear of any talk show host, is forgetting the person's name, because I mean, they're in your studio, and this is the first time they've been on a radio. They know your name. It's like, I'm on the radio, but for the talk show host, that's the perhaps 8th, 10th guest they've had all week. So unless it's somebody who's very well known or very familiar, or someone they've dealt with on a regular basis, you'll forget their name. So you have to have it written down in front of you, because you're watching the clock, you're watching the phones, you're thinking of your next question, you're trying to listen to the guest. You have a mind freeze, and you know what happens when you have a mind freeze. You just panic, and then it's gone for at least 2 weeks. So I've forgotten names. So when I worked in TV, I would do live shots, and I had one time where I forgot the guy's name. I had interviewed him 20 times, but I forgot his name right then and there, and then my mind froze, and I panicked, and I just said, I covered it. Thank you very much, the director of the fair, whatever it was. So from then on, I would put an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, the person I was doing the live shot with, I put their name on the paper in big letters, and I put it at my feet, and I would tell the person, look, don't take offense. I'm putting your name there, even though I know you very well, in case I forget, in the heat of the moment here. So that's one thing that happens to me a lot. What was your original question?
What is it like doing a live show, having to control that flow in a way that will sound good for a listener?
Yeah, well, it's remarkably. A good talk show is very well produced. So your intro is written. You've done the research and background. You've come up with a list of questions that you definitely want to ask. Questions are written so they're conversational, and then so they can get the most information out of your guest. But the best shows, you put those questions aside. I generally don't write questions. I write an outline of points that I want to get to, and I'll refer to that. But the key to doing a talk show or a podcast interview is to listen. So many interviewers do not listen. It's amazing that they don't listen. They're worried about their next question. They're worried about sounding smart. They're worried about the clock. They're worried about their levels on the audio board. So they're not listening to the person they're speaking to. If you just listen and react to what they're saying, it'll make it for a good conversation. Then every once in a while, just make sure you're on track with the questions you want, and that'll make the conversation go well.
It's amazing how audio has kind of come back, because the radio was for TV or whatever, the big thing, and then it kind of goes away, and now podcasts are huge. Yeah. So I'm wondering, as someone who's worked in it for so long, what you think, and maybe this is kind of a abstract question, but what do you think the appeal for people is to get, their news orally?
It's convenience. It always has been convenience. I mean, back in the day, before you had TV, people used to sit around the big radio in their living room and listen to radio speeches and radio dramas and things like that. Those days are gone. But the bread and butter for radio has always been the car, the dashboard. Drive time radio is where we have our most listeners, because people are listening to us as they're driving to work or driving home. So, actually, 93% of the American public still listens to the radio at least once a week. It's down from 95% over the past 10 years, but it's still 93%. And it's because of that convenience. When you get up in the morning, you turn on the radio as you're making your coffee, as you're putting your makeup on, as you're shaving, as you're perhaps even in the shower, because you're doing other things while you're listening to the radio. And I think the same thing holds true for podcasting. It's an extra step in that you have to subscribe to the podcast, and the phones have make it. See, podcast has had two lives. When the iPod first came out, where the word pod comes from, you had to download each episode, and it was a pain in the neck. You had to sync your iPod to the computer with a cord, and you had to download it. And podcasting was really niche then. It didn't really take off until the smartphone came along. Now it's automatic. You subscribe to that podcast. It's in your feed every day. You can control how many episodes you want. I generally keep 2 episodes for every podcast that I listen to. And then when there's nothing on the radio that I want to listen to, or I want something different, I'll just go through my feed and press on it. So that has given new life to podcasting. That's when it really took off. Again, it's convenience. It's all about the user experience. So people are using podcasts as they're walking to class, walking to work, driving to work. The dashboards in cars are changing, which is something that us radio programmers have to be very conscious of. The smart dashboard, as they become easier and easier to use, is a real threat to live radio. So we have to make sure that live radio is as meaningful as a podcast, with traffic reports, breaking news, weather reports, things like that. But I think radio, movies were going to kill radio, TV was going to kill radio, computers were going to kill radio, cassettes were going to kill radio, CDs were going to kill radio. 93% of the people still listen to the radio. So I think we'll be okay, at least for till I retire. That's what I'm hoping for. I got 10 or 15 years left, just until I retire.
So you mentioned you did some TV. What do you see the differences in being able to not be filmed while speaking and actually have that conversation? Do you think it's similar, or is it a lot easier to do radio, do you think?
Well, TV is a team sport. That's the biggest difference. In radio, you're sitting in front of a microphone. You control your own audio board, your console. You're in charge of getting yourself on the air. You write your own script for the most part. You pick your own sound bites to play. You can do it yourself. You do have engineers in the background who keep your station on the air, and they're vital. But when you're actually producing your work, you can do it on your own. TV is not that way. You have a camera person, a photographer, who has to keep you in focus and make sure your audio works well. And then once you're doing a newscast, you have a whole studio crew. So that's the biggest difference between radio and TV that I've found, because I've moved from radio to TV, and I do a little bit of both. So for control freaks, it's harder to do TV because you really do rely on other people. But on the other hand, it's a good experience to work with other folks. Storytelling is storytelling. With TV, you're doing it with pictures. Radio, you're doing it with sound and your voice and your writing. So the writing is a little different. You have to write to the pictures for television. In radio, you have to be a little bit more descriptive in your writing because you don't have pictures to help the listener see what's going on.
You touched on this a little bit earlier about the convergence, and you talked about how you do TV and radio, and they kind of had the same underlying storytelling skills. How much have you seen, especially in, I don't know, like the last 10 years with ad revenue changing, where, people coming out of journalism school kind of need to be able to do everything?
Well, I mean, they do, because, I went running this morning. I run in the early morning just as the sun's coming up, and that's the time when newspapers are delivered. And just over the past 10 years, fewer and fewer driveways have newspapers at the end of them. It's just remarkable. I could count on one hand in my neighborhood how many folks actually have a paper newspaper. I think the newspaper industry is adjusting. I think the paywalls are up and people are accepting them, and they were getting some revenue from subscribers. They've had some cuts. They definitely have had some cuts in newsrooms, personnel-wise, and I think you're going to see more and more newspapers go away because the next biggest expense is the actual paper that they're printed on. So when you cut the paper expenses, then ad revenue can, help, but it's still going to be a struggle. I think that, again, for reporters coming out of school, know how to do everything and be willing to adapt and be flexible. And it's really easy for young people today because, you're all digital natives. You've been dealing with computers and smartphones since you were born. I joke that the term digital native is so overhyped. I mean, at some point they were fire natives. They were born when fire was discovered, or they were wheel natives. That they were born after the wheel was invented. So I think the digital native is not a whole lot different than any of those eras in humanity, but it does make it easier for folks to adapt to the new technology.
So wrapping all that up into I guess kind of a neat ball, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask while you were here. We have a few people in from the industry. When people come out of Ohio State or in Ohio State, what is it that you look for in interns that want to come to WOSU, and what makes a successful intern, I guess?
Well, the first thing that really makes is someone comes to us. We kind of let our interns self-select. We put the word out to professors and things like that we're looking for interns. But if someone comes to us of their own free will, that we didn't recruit them or drag them in, that's the first indication that they want to work in radio and they want to work in news and journalism. So take the initiative, whether it's an internship or a job. Take the initiative and show your potential employer that you really want to do this. So that's the first thing. After that, we're looking for somebody who is curious, who wants to tell a story, and can write. It really comes down to writing and paying attention to current events. I give all of my reporter candidates a pop quiz, a current events quiz. Is the last thing they do when the interview wraps up. Give them 12 questions, and you'd be amazed how many folks who have been on the planet for 30 years cannot do well on that test. Never mind that they want to work in journalism. I mean, questions like, who are the 2 U.S. senators in your state? And they'll miss that. It's like, come on, you want to work in news and you don't know that? So read the newspaper or the websites, pay attention to what's going on, read critically, try to dissect how that story was put together, analyze the quotes. What is the person saying in the quotes? How is the reporter written it? What's important? It comes down to basic curiosity and being able to write. And that's what really is the foundation for anyone who wants to work in journalism.
Thank you for joining us on the Student Slant. Be sure to check back next week for more student perspective.